thank you for listening and supporting the Daily Memphian. Sign up for one of our many free newsletters and breaking news alerts at dailymemphian.com/email to receive the latest local news stories impacting our community. Our weekly newsletters cover everything from sports to arts and culture, business, food, and more, along with daily updates of all the news we publish each day. Sign up or manage your email preferences at dailymemphian.com/email.
This is the Daily Memphian Politics Podcast. I'm Bill Dries. The main event is budget season with the chairman of the Memphis City Council's Budget Committee, Worth Morgan. Top of the podcast, the County Commission approves a $2,450,000 settlement of the federal class action lawsuit from the 2016 rollout of a new tracking system for those in the local criminal justice system, including those in the Shelby County Jail. What came to be known by a sort of political shorthand as the Odyssey system replaced a 30-year-old tracking system and in short order made it very hard to tell who was where in the system and when they were to be released. The result was people unable to get even a hearing to find out if they could make bail, people rearrested because the warrant for their arrest in the system was never cleared after they turned themselves in or were arrested on the warrant. This lawsuit had 40 plaintiffs and sought class action status. The settlement was approved by the County Commission without discussion, as it was added to the Commission's agenda this past week with no advance notice. Speaking of the Commission, the proposal to move from property reappraisals for taxation purposes every 4 years to a reappraisal every other year is going back to committee for more discussion and probably some changes. Commissioner Van Turner withdrew the proposal by Assessor Melvin Burgess Jr. this past week as Commissioner Michael Whaley withdrew his idea of making a 2023 reappraisal a pilot project or test case to see what the numbers look like. Whaley's idea was to have the Commission review the 2023 numbers and values and then decide if that should trigger reappraisal notices and a resetting of local property tax rates for the county and the 7 cities within Shelby County. Meanwhile, MAR, the Memphis Area Association of Realtors, expressing concerns about every other year reappraisals, specifically whether this will put pressure on the appeals process. There didn't appear to be 7 firm votes on the Commission to pass the proposal this time around, marking the third delay in as many meetings on this issue. Turner indicating there is one more attempt left in this for him, probably with some adjustments in committee, but he also said whatever comes out of this, he wants a vote up or down and no more delays. U.S. Census numbers in and Tennessee among the states with no population gains or losses, meaning nationally the state sticks with 9 members of the U.S. House. The Tennessee legislature still to draw the district lines not only for itself, but also for the 9 congressional districts. The county's only countywide Republican elected official opening her re-election campaign, District Attorney General Amy Weirich, talking about criminal justice reform during her opening fundraiser in Germantown, telling a group of about 100 that, quote, justice and safety must coexist, and that she cannot support, quoting again, reform that is simply release that supports reform for the sake of change. Weirich's campaign expects a well-funded Democratic challenger emerging from the May primaries going to the August general elections. Democrats indicating this race is a priority for the local party. It's also important for a local Democratic Party that swept the 2018 edition of this election cycle with new blood from activists brought to the table in part by activism around criminal justice reform. Weirich won a full 8-year term in 2014, that after her appointment to the position by Governor Bill Haslam and running in a special election for the rest of Bill Gibbons' term as DA. In 2014, she likely expected a vigorous Democratic challenge that wound up being retired Judge Joe Brown. Democrats thought Brown's ratings as a syndicated television judge would carry not only him but the rest of the Democratic slate into county offices. Brown became the top of the ticket and mounted a vocal campaign in which he talked more about the race for juvenile court judge that he wasn't in than the race he was in. Every countywide Democratic nominee on the ballot, including Brown, lost to Republicans. The race for juvenile court judge is another 8-year term on the 2022 ballot. Unlike the district attorney general's race, it is nonpartisan in that it does not have May primaries. In every other way, though, it is a partisan race with both local parties involved in the campaigns. That will certainly be the case in 2022 as well. Shelby County Republicans holding their convention at Arlington High School to elect a new chairman. Kerry Vaughn elected without opposition and telling the group of around 200 Republicans that the local party needs new members and new candidates, specifically new candidates in place of those Republicans who have run repeatedly for the same offices. Vaughn saying for all of the planning and organizing work, the results of the 2022 county elections will determine the party's success 4 years after Democrats swept the 2018 county elections. So it would appear we're in the political season. Let's review some of the key dates coming up, but not too many. Early voting in advance of the May 3rd, 2022 county primaries is less than a year away, starting the vote on April 13th. First day for candidates to pick up and file qualifying petitions is this December 20th. Coming to the 2022 statewide ballot a year from this November, with approval this past week in the Tennessee legislature, is a proposed amendment to the Tennessee Constitution, adding right-to-work status for the state. Still to come, competing political strategies around the state's requirement that for such an item to pass, it must have the approval of a majority of those who voted in the general election governor's race on the same ballot. This week, a new political action committee formed called Beat Bill Lee, as you might guess, pointed at defeating the Republican governor's re-election effort next year. In the legislature, Republican Senator Brian Kelsey's proposal to ban local governments from challenging the constitutionality of laws approved by the legislature stumbles in the state Senate. The Tennessee Journal reporting Fayette County Republican Paige Wally bringing up the small schools lawsuit of the 1990s as an example of necessary intervention by lawsuit. Kelsey's amendment failed on a 14-14 tie vote, but Kelsey looking at another amendment to do just about the same thing as we record. Along the way, some questions being raised outside the Capitol about whether it's constitutional to have a state law that bars local governments from challenging the constitutionality of laws. The American Conservative Union Foundation, Matt Schlapp's organization that puts on the set of CPAC's Conservative Political Action Conferences, including several here in Memphis, out with its annual ratings of U.S. House and Senate members by how conservative they are. In the Tennessee delegation to Washington, Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn gets a 96% score, tying for the top with Congressman Scott Desjardins in the delegation. Republican Senator Bill Hagerty, not yet included. Former Senator Lamar Alexander, who Hagerty succeeded, scored a 74%. Congressman David Kustoff of Germantown, a 78% score. Democratic Congressman Steve Cohen of Memphis and Jim Cooper of Nashville getting 0%, and Cohen proudly tweeting his score as soon as it came out. We are joined now by Memphis City Council member Worth Morgan, chairman of what is considered the most critical committee on the City Council, the Budget Committee. A few dollar figures, Memphis Mayor Jim Strickland has submitted a $716 million operating budget proposal and an $89 million capital budget. No property tax hike proposed, although the city's $3.19 property tax rate will likely go to a range of between $2.75 to $2.80 based on new property values in the recent countywide property reappraisal. That reappraisal showed a 23% increase overall in property values across the city of Memphis. And of course, it goes without saying that your individual property valuation might vary from that percentage. As we record this on a Thursday, council members are about to have their first in-person meeting in more than a year, a Saturday budget retreat ahead of budget committee sessions that begin Monday, May 3rd. We will, of course, be there as well and reporting on what comes out of all of these discussions. Councilman, we aren't exactly out of the pandemic, but how do you see this budget season differing from the one a year ago that was firmly in the shadow of the pandemic?
Well, thank you for having me, Bill. I hope the process is a lot easier for council members. You got to remember, we also had a lot of council members that were going through the budget for the first time last year. And this is a lot of information that has a lot of context to it. And I think that was made all the more difficult by not being able to be in person, to be able to ask questions face to face and kind of have, side conversations with directors and our CFO about what exactly all this means and adds up to. Mm-hmm. So we've got a more experienced council going into this budget than we did last year. And I think being back in person is always an asset in politics.
And if I remember correctly, you all had actually started with an original budget proposal that actually kind of got scrambled and turned upside down because obviously by the time the mayor addressed us, the pandemic was something that was being discussed. But once it came to town, I mean, things started closing. Everything pretty much turned upside down.
Incorrect. And we didn't know how the pandemic was going to affect human behavior. I mean, that was impossible to predict. And if we can't predict that, then we don't know how sales tax revenue, hotel, motel tax revenue, things like that the city relies on, whether or not we were going to be able to have kind of traditional revenue streams. And so we projected, I believe it was $50 million in sales tax for the budget that we're in now. But what the reality is it's coming in 40% over our estimates. And we think we're going to get 70 million in revenue from sales tax in the fiscal year 2021. And it's people weren't going to restaurants and stores as much, but they were still shopping and we were still collecting that revenue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to make it even more complex and even stranger, while overall sales tax outperformed what you thought as a whole, the sales tax coming into the tourism development zone, which is people staying in the hotels and things like that definitely underperformed.
Correct, as well as taxes on liquor or services and fees, permits. There were fewer permits that were applied for as a result, court fees. So it was, we've got a lot of different line items in the city budget, and trying to predict which were going to go up and which were going to go down was a tough task.
Mm-hmm. So to the present, is it safe? And we should point out to those who don't swim in this every day, this budget is for the fiscal year that begins on July 1st, and the current fiscal year will end accordingly on June 30th. Is it safe for the council to assume that the latest round of federal funding by the American Rescue Plan Act over 2 years and totaling $160 million to $168 million, that will take care of all of the revenue the city has lost directly or indirectly because of the pandemic?
I don't know if anything is perfectly safe when it comes to government budgeting, but it would be, yes, I think by all the estimates that I've seen, that will be sufficient to cover our revenue losses. And then the question will be what other sources or additional expenses that we may have incurred from the pandemic will we be allowed to spend on? We don't know all the guidance yet coming from the federal government. I think there's more that's set to be released in the next 2 weeks. And we're going to be continually pitched on how we're allowed to spend those funds by our CFO and by the state comptroller.
Mm-hmm. And the mayor's total budget proposal here of $716 million is only, and I say that relatively, only $8 million above the budget that you all wound up with a year ago. So this is lean starting out.
Great. I think, as the mayor was talking about, there's still uncertainty. We still don't know how things are going to fold out. And so you don't want to be overly optimistic and put yourself behind the eight ball in a bad position fiscally. And I will say, just again, to explain to people listening about our budget process who don't swim in the stream every day, he proposed, as you said, a $716 operating budget and an $89 million capital budget, but that's not the entirety of the city expenditures in a year, because we also have other kind of revenue funds in terms of we have a solid waste budget that's $75 million. Mm-hmm. We have a special revenue fund that's $12 million, a sewer fund that's $154 million, stormwater fund, which is $27 million. And all of that totals up to be about $1.25 billion.
Right.
So we had a lot of other expenditures, including debt service, that don't necessarily get as much attention. They're a little bit more fixed, but they are critical parts of city services.
Right. So 716 is what is called the general fund.
Correct. Where we pay for police and fire and parks and libraries.
Right. Right. To get to some specific items, ahead of the mayor's budget address last month, you and other council members heard from Gary Rosenfeld, the CEO of the Memphis Area Transit Authority. And at that point, he was hoping for somewhere between $4 million to $10 million in the mayor's plan to get the $35 million transit vision plan he's had on the shelf for a while off the shelf and started in a very limited way. I didn't hear anything about that in the mayor's speech. Do you know if that's in the budget's fine print, so to speak?
In the fine print, again, what I have in front of me so far are numbers and line items, and we're going to go through a whole month of presentations that will add context to the numbers I have in front of me now. And those are valuable. But from what I can see now, I think the short answer is no. I don't see that additional increase for MATA. I think there is a majority will amongst the city council to fund MATA to a greater extent. What we don't have a majority opinion on is what would need to be cut in order to fund MATA. Everybody's got different ideas, and some have proposed them. And in each case, it's failed.
Well, and speaking of that, you had a proposal to take $2.6 million that was for community grants to be made by council members, and instead put that into MATA's column or a budget. Is that ruled out because it didn't make it then, or is there a possibility you could try for that again?
Can certainly try for it again. I think we have some very core services talking about transportation, public safety, making sure that our parks are adequate, and not only adequate, but exciting attractions for people in their neighborhoods. And the city council grant program just doesn't fit into the core priorities of the city of Memphis. And it's really council members donating to charities that do great work. And they're some of our favorite charities across the city, and they do well with the funds they're given. But I think I would prefer for the citizens of Memphis to be donating to the charities of their choice, rather than for the council members to use taxpayer dollars to donate to the charities of their choice.
Right.
And we should focus on core services like MATA.
Mm-hmm. And when you brought this up, the council had a very full discussion on this with a lot of different viewpoints on it. But to me, it's kind of a microcosm of a larger question that the council has traditionally at budget time. And that is it better to find a relatively small amount of money in the budget and divide that among a lot of items? Or is it better, in your opinion, to find that same amount of money in the budget for one priority when it comes to the council putting its fingerprints on the budget in some way?
I don't know if I get pigeonholed into saying one is better than the other if we couldn't kind of weigh exactly what was being talked about. And in this case, I think it'd be better for MATA to have the $2.6 million. Does it solve all their problems? No, but we don't have a lot of cuts to make in the budget that are, $10 million chomps. We have to piece it together from multiple different sources to get to the funding that we need for some of the bigger ticket items. And the needs of MATA is a big one. It's tough. And I think having the expectation that it's all going to come from one source, a clean motion over here to give money to MATA over there, that's not a realistic expectation.
Right. Right. It usually comes about from several different parts, a little bit here, a little bit there, and then you've got one total amount of all of those to kind of deal with. In President Biden's first speech to Congress this past week, he talked about universal pre-kindergarten. If that translates to federal funding, and it's a big if at this point, but if that translates to federal funding for what is already a local, city, and county priority, does that mean the local funding that's been rounded up and allocated by both governments for this is possibly back in play for other purposes?
It might. So we do $6 million a year. And to go back to all those funding levels I was talking about, whether it be operating or special revenue, the pre-K funding of $6 million a year isn't included in any of those budgets. It was totally set aside by council several years ago, and it's not really up for a vote in this year's operating budget because it's a set aside special tax and then expenditure.
Right.
And so, but if the federal government's going to take care of pre-K spending, that may alleviate $6 million for us on an annual basis.
And that conceivably could come up at any time. For instance, if you get the word that the feds are going to fund this and it's past budget season, well, then you all take a look at what essentially is a fund where you put this money and set it to the side. And some of the reason for doing that was so that people would have assurances that, this money is going to be used for that. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. In the last year, we've seen some complex financial transactions requiring council approval. That included the use of pilot extension funds for the city, specifically the Downtown Memphis Commission, to buy the 100 North Main building. Some concerns about sales tax revenue going into the downtown tourism development zone. Are these complex transactions overall to keep projects moving in the pandemic, or is it the nature of public financing to incentivize private investments, which are pretty complex transactions at any time?
I think it would be the latter, where these are complex transactions. And, just for example, we have a downtown improvement district where they pay a higher assessed tax rate than everybody else, and that revenue goes to fund projects in the downtown area. That's something that they were willing to do in the 90s to try to improve downtown and spur development, and it's been enormously successful. But it is a particular captured revenue that is spent specifically in that area. And so there's certain things like that, and the hotel motel tax, where we tax people coming in from out of town using the hotels, and then we try to set aside that tax revenue for things that will continue to benefit tourism and maybe the hotel industry, the entertainment industry, things that are going to bring, again, more people to the city of Memphis. So it does get complex. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but the more that you have growth in the city of Memphis, I think this is kind of the underlying principle. The more growth you have in the city of Memphis, the more projects that get constructed and completed and are successful, the greater property tax revenue, sales tax revenue you have coming into the coffers of the city of Memphis. And that helps alleviate the burden to everybody across the entire community in terms of what they have to pay into the system to get the services that we provide. So there's certainly an economic spiral up in terms of benefits to the community if we can offer the incentives to get these projects going.
Do you expect that someone might move for a property tax increase this year once you all settle on the new recertified tax rate?
Yeah, it's certainly been discussed. It wouldn't be my preference. I think there's a big psychological impact to us finally getting the tax rate under $3 there. And I think there are some cuts, again, to non-core services that I would prefer to make rather than asking the citizens to chip in more. And it gets floated every time. And this would probably be And this is important to explain to the media and to the viewers, this would probably be one of the politically easiest times or most confusing times to get a tax increase through. So we have a rate of 3.19 that is going to be automatically adjusted down, as you said earlier. And so it could be, and if it gets adjusted down to say 2.80, it could be that a city council member would make a motion to increase that rate back up from 2.80 to say $2.99 or $3. Mm-hmm. And so we would have, the tax rate would still have gone down, but we would be collecting more revenue in property tax. So essentially it is a property tax increase. But then again, it's all dependent on what your appraisal did. If your appraisal was flat, you would still have a tax break. If your appraisal went up 20%, you would certainly have a property tax increase. So there's enough gray area and confusion where the people that would be, I think, and have been talking about having a tax increase for years, that this would be, I think, a politically optimal time to try to propose it. Right. Now, I don't know if that motion will have a second. I don't know if it'll have 7 votes. Like I said, it wouldn't be my priority until we were a little more disciplined, I think, in spending before we collected more revenue.
And if the recertified rate, let's go with your example, was $2.80, and that's what the readjusted rate is to produce the same amount of revenue that the current tax rate produces with the 2017 reappraisal values. So the council does that. In order to go above that recertified rate, by state law, there would have to be a separate proposal to raise the tax rate even more, correct?
Correct. It won't be done on the sly. It'll be very obvious, but then it'll be up to, I think, how it's reported on and how it's argued of what the conversation is around that proposal. But and it's called the windfall provision to make sure that as values go up, that there's not some huge windfall to the government, that we automatically adjust down our rate, and then a council member will have to make a separate motion to increase it again.
Okay. All right. Something we'll be watching for closely. How do you feel about $2 million that the mayor has proposed to get his violence intervention program underway?
Yeah, at this point, I would say public safety has been and still is my number one priority. We have tried a lot of things over the last 6 years, and I'm willing to keep trying more. So I'm interested to continue hearing about this new program of the mayor's, but I think we need to be real honest on the front end. Some measurables you just can't track, and it's difficult to know what the impact is that we're having directly from one program. But if there are any measurables we can take in place in terms of number of contacts that the program is having with individuals, anything that's done, I think, down the road, we're going to want to ask, has this program been successful? If not, maybe the funding would be better used elsewhere. If it has been successful, can we scale it up even further? And so on the front end, as we're having a discussion about funding it, I want to make sure we're going to have a good conversation about what will success or unsuccess, or I guess unsuccess might not be a word. What will success or failure look like down the road in whether we should stay with the program?
Sure. And we should point out that this is not a police department program. This is an effort that would be outside of the police department and would involve civilians with some level of training to basically go and talk to people who have been involved in violent altercations and basically talk them down, talk to their friends and talk them out of trying to retaliate for that and continue the cycle of violence. It is a one-on-one intervention program on the streets, and it requires a lot of training for those people that are going and having tough discussions with some tough people. Mm-hmm. On a related note, what do you think of the mayor's nominee to be the next police chief, C.J. Davis?
I've been impressed so far. We've gotten together and talked. I had about 20 questions I wanted to go through, and I think we only got through 6 of them. It's like I said, it's a topic that's extremely important to me, and it's an almost impossible position. It is a difficult position in terms of what is required. But what I'm hoping for is we have somebody. We've tried a lot. I want to keep trying new ideas. I want to keep pushing for what works. We've got to have a high priority on recruitment and increasing the number of officers that we have. We've agreed to what the complement should be, but we're nowhere close to that number. And that is going to have a major impact on policing and crime in Memphis in the years to come. And that's going to also be a big focus of mine as I look at this budget. Of whether or not it's kind of the same old pitch as usual, which is a good pitch and it's optimistic, but it just hasn't quite been achieving the levels of recruitment that we desperately need. So there is a community meeting on, I guess, early Friday afternoon. And I'm going to be tuned into that because whoever has that job has to be an effective communicator with the public. I've gone through her YouTube videos, going back to her days as police chief in Durham, and watched a few of them as well. And I've been impressed so far, but it's a tough responsibility.
All right. A final point. You talked about this at the top about kind of the benefit of live meetings and council members being there with one another. When you all get together on Saturday for this budget retreat, what's that going to be like after I think you all only had 5 meetings in person of the group elected and reelected in 2019?
Yeah, so we're going to meet in the recently renovated convention center, which we're excited to see. And it's not entirely a budget retreat. There will be some other items on the agenda in terms of what's going on in Nashville, legislative priorities. I'll be doing a budget presentation early on, and we won't be getting into the details of the numbers and who prefers what. I think we're just mostly going to talk about process. But now that people are getting vaccinated and getting out and about again, it's just going to be good to be back in person. Even if we're arguing in person, it's going to be good to see them rather than talking past one another through a computer screen. So I think there's something missing from public service and politics when you take out the human element and you have to communicate through electronics. So I'm very much looking forward to it.
All right, more to come. We've been talking with Memphis City Council Budget Committee Chairman Worth Morgan. On WKNO's Behind the Headlines this week, the new president of the Downtown Memphis Commission and the former director of Housing and Community Development for the city of Memphis, Paul Young. You can hear the program on the Behind the Headlines podcast. Subscribe to the Daily Memphian at dailymemphian.com. You can subscribe to this podcast and our others at Google Podcast, iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher. I'm Bill Dries. The Daily Memphian Politics Podcast is produced by Kix Patterson.
In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.